Good afternoon, everybody. Can you hear? Is this working? Okay. My name is Rob Lee. I'm Program Director with the Climate Action Reserve, and I have the great privilege of moderating this panel on new opportunities for voluntary emissions reductions. As I was kind of thinking about this topic, it's quite a broad topic, and we could spend all day here talking about all the different ways that we could achieve emission reductions through voluntary means. So I just wanted to start by providing a little bit of context as well as some information that I learned newly today. So according to Ecosystem Marketplace's State of the Voluntary Carbon Market that was released last year, 2017, the volume of voluntary carbon offsets shrank about a quarter between 2015 and 2016. That said, earlier today, in the State of the North American Carbon Market panel, we were told that corporate demand for voluntary mitigation credits has skyrocketed since the Trump administration announced that the U.S. would be pulling out of the Paris Agreement. So clearly the voluntary marketplace remains an extremely important space. I think in addition to providing an outlet for companies and companies and organizations who want to act on climate change but don't really have a regulated framework to do so, and it can also serve as a testing ground for novel ideas and programs that align voluntary buyers' missions and values with climate change mitigation projects. And as we heard from Dr. Ramanathan this morning, I think increased investment into greenhouse gas mitigation is of extreme importance. In light of this, at the Reserve, we've been working over the previous year on a new mitigation program with the intent of really driving greater engagement and investment into greenhouse gas reduction projects. And in addition to touching on their work in that program, our panel of experts today will be discussing the innovative programs and projects that they've been working on to continue pushing the envelope and finding cost-efficient and effective ways of combating climate change within the voluntary space. So I'd like to first introduce Henry Hilkin of the Bay Area Air Quality Management District. Henry is the Director of Planning and Climate Protection at the Bay Area AQMD. The Air District is responsible for assuring clean air in the 9-county San Francisco Bay Area. Mr. Hilkin oversees preparation of regional air quality plans, climate protection activities, the Community Air Risk Evaluation Program, air quality modeling, preparation of emission inventories, and transportation and land use programs. Henry.
Great. Thank you, Rob. Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for the invite to be here. It's really a pleasure. It's always a really good conference. And I'm especially glad to be here because I just a few minutes ago got a text from my office. There's an armed maniac in the neighborhood down the street from my office. They're telling us all to stay indoors, so I'm glad I'm up here rather than down on Beale Street where the rest of my colleagues are. So as noted in the introduction, I work for a regulatory agency, so I'm going to address this topic through our lens as an air quality and climate pollutant regulator and policy person. So we are the air pollution agency for the 9-county Bay Area. Our mission since the 50s has been to assure clean air for the public in the Bay Area. And about 12 years ago, we established a climate protection program at the district to incorporate energy efficiency and greenhouse gas reductions into our clean air programs. Just last year, we adopted an update to our clean air plan. It was exactly a year ago, right at the same time as this conference, and it's our 2017 Clean Air Plan laid out our air pollution strategy, but also a climate strategy. It's an integrated multi-pollutant clean air plan that lays out a variety of tools to reduce pollution and reduce greenhouse gases. So when we work on greenhouse gases, we really use every tool at our disposal. We use our regulatory authority. We use our grants and incentives. We use a lot of public education. We do a lot of work with cities and counties, providing technical support to local staff, disseminating best practices, and so forth. In our Clean Air Plan, one of the things we did is we set long-range targets for greenhouse gas reductions for the region. And so the goals that our board of directors established are consistent with the state's goals. So it's 40% below 1990 by 2030 and 80% below 1990 by 2050. So the Bay Area's goals are the same as the state's goals. So as I said, we work on these programs through all the different tools in our toolbox. One of the things that we do a lot with cities and counties is provide, as I said, technical assistance. And in several different ways, but a couple that are germane today, we provide assistance on local plans and local climate action plans. So how can you make your most robust local climate action plan? So we do a lot of technical support with local city and county staff. We also have CEQA guidelines. So are we all from California here? Everybody knows what CEQA is? Okay. Public agencies have to evaluate and identify the potential adverse environmental impacts of any action they take. So most local agencies don't have air quality experts. So for many, many years, we have issued guidance to cities and counties. Here are our recommendations on how you should do that air quality, and more recently, air quality and greenhouse gas analysis. We last updated those in 2010, and we had several different, one of the key benchmarks in the CEQA process is a threshold of significance. What's that yardstick a decision-making body would use to decide whether or not there is a significant impact? So for a land use development project, for instance, how does the city or county determine whether or not there's a significant impact on climate change? And so we proposed several different optional thresholds that people could use, quantitative thresholds, do the numbers, calculate your emissions, and we had two different options. One is just sort of a bright line set threshold, another is essentially a per capita threshold, GHGs per capita. And then we had recommended it as an option as a qualitative threshold. So consistency with a good, robust, qualifying climate action plan. Those thresholds were based on the 2020 targets from AB 32 and the first scoping plan. 2020 is just right around the corner. So we're updating the guidelines right now because we realized pegging it to 2020 just isn't going to cut it at all. So we're now working with some consultants, and we're working back, staff is hard at work back at the office, thinking about different options for how we will update those recommended thresholds, at least to 2030, possibly even to 2050. And I think it will still be some sort of combination of a quantitative per capita type threshold and then a more qualitative consistency with a qualified clean air climate action plan. So I think that we have seen requests already. There is interest on voluntary offsets from lead agencies and project developers who have a significant impact that need to mitigate. They try to mitigate on site as best they can, but often, especially for larger projects, that's just not possible. So voluntary offsets are a powerful tool that developers and lead agencies can use to minimize those impacts. So we have some experience with these voluntary offset programs. We certainly have implemented regulatory offset programs for decades under the Clean Air Act. But these voluntary programs, we've done a few ad hoc programs, more on the pollution side, where a developer needs to get below that significant threshold, and we've entered into agreements to implement certain programs that we administer to get some emission reductions that then we will agree with that project proponent and lead agency. You can claim that as mitigation towards your project. We haven't done that ourselves for greenhouse gases yet, but what we have done is we've worked with other California air districts within an organization called the California Air Pollution Control Officers Association, CAPCOA, sort of the umbrella group of all of us air quality regulators in the state. And so a few years ago, we, after a lot of work, established a clearinghouse, essentially, a bulletin board, if you will, of voluntary offset projects that could be listed. The idea was that people could bring their project. They would have to meet very rigorous protocols, either from the California Air Resources Board or from CAR. And if your project meets these protocols, you could list it, and it would essentially be it's not an exchange, but it's essentially a bulletin board where buyers and sellers can match up. Didn't really take off, I'm going to be honest. Not a whole lot of interest out there. Very, very little interest. It was somewhat disappointing. So we're struggling with that right now. It's too bad. We're trying to inject some life into it. I do remain hopeful that there will be interest, especially once we have updated these guidelines. I think that will increase the interest. It will increase the need for mitigation for projects. So as when we think about voluntary offsets, when we work on these programs, there are a few things that are priorities for us. Certainly greenhouse gas reductions are first and foremost. Getting projects that reduce GHGs into the atmosphere. Almost as important, though, are that these programs be very, very rigorous. I think most people that work in this space know the terms from the Clean Air Act of real, quantifiable, surplus, enforceable, verifiable, all those tests that traditional air quality offset programs have to meet under the Clean Air Act. Now, often in this space, in the greenhouse gas space, those are very, very important to us. There's a lot of room for abuse, so having very, very rigorous protocols is going to be always going to be a very high priority for us. And I guess the last thing I would highlight is local air quality co-benefits. We have, regionally, we're doing a pretty good job on air pollution. In the Bay Area, we have very good pollution levels. But we do have certain neighborhoods in the region that are disproportionately impacted by air pollution because they're near industry or because they're near goods movement or because they're near freeways. And they're usually the people that are most susceptible and most vulnerable to the effects of air pollution. And so we, at the Air District, for many years have had programs that really drill down into those local exposures. But as most of you are aware, and as was touched upon this morning, it has become much more of a priority for the state of California. The cap and trade reauthorization bill last year, there was a companion bill to it, AB 617, that requires the California Air Resources Board and local air districts like mine to work together to identify those disproportionately impacted communities and develop programs, working with the community to develop programs to improve those health conditions. So that's, my colleague Kristen is in the back. That's basically all we're doing these days, folks. We are all 617 all the time. And so, well, we're still working on climate, but we are really looking at our air pollution and health issues at a very localized level. So that's a little bit controversial. Some people certainly make an argument that, look, if you want air pollution and health improvements, design programs that do that. If you want greenhouse gas reductions, design programs that do that. Don't try and mix them together. And I get that, and I hope to hear an interesting conversation about that. But I'm just telling you, that's every air pollution person in the state of California, that is how we are looking at the world. And so I think moving forward with voluntary offsets, I'm hopeful that our updated CEQA guidelines will increase demand and might kickstart interest in these voluntary offsets. But I think we will all be challenged to look for projects where there are co-benefits, where we get GHG benefits and we do get pollution and health benefits. I'll stop there, Rob.
Thanks, Henry. And I think your point on co-benefits and local projects is something that we'll probably be talking a lot about.
I think so.
Next, I'd like to introduce Ken Newcomb, to my right here. Ken's bio I could spend quite a while on Ken's bio, so I'll summarize, but just know that I'm skipping over some really important parts. Ken has over 35 years of experience in developing financially viable, sustainable energy and forest projects in developing countries. At the World Bank, Ken initiated and led the first global carbon fund, the Prototype Carbon Fund, and managed the growth of the World Bank's carbon finance business to a total of 8 carbon funds and over $1 billion. After leaving the World Bank in 2005, Ken joined management teams in climate change capital in London and Goldman Sachs in New York, before accepting the role of building Sequest Capital as CEO. Ken.
Well, thank you very much. Let me put my self-timer on. I do want to, and I'm going to rely on you. I do want to say that I'm thrilled to be here. I've never been to a conference here, an NACW conference, and it's turning out to be a really exhilarating experience and timely, I'd say, in terms of where the global carbon market is coming and the evolution of the Californian market. Who's Sequest? Well, we're a company that is focused on providing sustainable energy to the poor, particularly the rural poor, and particularly in the least developed countries in the world, and where they're not least developed by the UN definition, at least they are really poor communities in the developing countries per se. Our focus is on clean cooking, efficient cook stoves, but addressing household air pollution. And it's interesting that wood smoke, which is now the biggest killer of women and children in the world, the single biggest killer, is also a feature in the Bay Area of particular contributions to you, as it is in Sydney, by the way, my home country. Secondly, we focus on efficient lighting. So efficient lighting and efficient cooking have been our focus in Sub-Saharan Africa, in South Asia, in Central America, and now in East Asia, Cambodia and Laos. We have dominated the programs of activity issuance of emissions reductions under the CDM, 25% of total emissions reductions in that category, nearing 1 million carbon credits from the cook stove sector and over 2 million in the efficient lighting sector. We are focused also on renewable energy, mostly to supply sustainable biomass solutions for the urban charcoal market, which I hate charcoal with a passion and what it's doing to African and Asian countries in terms of devastating their agricultural landscapes, food security and water security. So trying to make some contribution to that, and also solar energy more recently in partnership with Tesla to bring solar storage to Africa for the first time at both grid and off-grid solutions. In terms of the evolution of the voluntary market, it's a little unclear to me why we would have a session only on voluntary now, because actually the distinction is entirely blurred. There is no prospect of a single global carbon commodity that can be traded with credibility across the post-Paris world. The idea of the CDM as providing a bankable, globally bankable single carbon currency inside the UN has gone. It has suffered from many things, including the credibility of the offsets themselves, significant proportions of which were really not additional tons. And that's put a pall over offsets per se. But what it's really created is the opportunity in the post-Paris world for those who will seek and are seeking offsets as part of their contributions to their nationally determined commitments to be very picky about what kind of projects will generate offsets. And instead of it being a commodity where they say, oh, it's good, it's issued by this registry, I can buy it, I can use it for compliance, just like the voluntary market, they too will look under the hood and they'll ask, what is the project which generates these emissions reductions? What is the contribution that it makes to sustainable development? What's the documentation or indeed the verification that that's true? And they will try and align their attempts to meet their obligations under the Paris Agreement with their contributions to sustainable development as a sovereign or as a corporate in terms of their role inside those compliance regimes, even if they're cap and trade regimes inside the countries that are party to the Paris Agreement. The corporates will also ask the question, what does this do to my corporate social responsibility? How does this reflect what I'm telling my stakeholders and shareholders is the good I'm doing while I'm producing the good or service that I'm trading? So that distinction is gone, in my view. The world is a patchwork quilt of different carbon standards and different approaches, and not all carbon credits are created equal. So in line with that, we have decided to focus on what we call transformation carbon. A brand we created probably prematurely about 5 or 6 years ago is now actually being taken up more and more by our corporate and our government clients. And they are as interested as anybody in knowing not only that there are significant co-benefits from the projects from which they're getting high integrity carbon credits, but they're interested in the possibility of having independent third-party verification of those co-benefits. As a result of that, we have worked with the gold standard that's another carbon registry, as I'm sure Robert knows, to generate a new methodology for documenting improved health outcomes from reducing household air pollution measured by PM 2.5, and working with my friends at Berkeley University, Kirk Smith and his team in particular. This is now published about a year ago, and we're looking to do the first trades under which a buyer will say, I will pay on delivery for averted disability-adjusted life years at a certain price, that price being enough for me to go and raise capital to provide super clean stoves and improved kitchen ventilation, ultimately to get cleaner air and less PM 2.5 inhaled by women and kids. No surprise to you, I'm sure, that if you cook over an open fire in the developing countries and you have a baby on your back, you and the baby are smoking 2 packs of cigarettes a day. And we are focused very much not just on getting credible carbon, but on having independently verifiable improved health outcomes. And finally, to reduce drudgery for women and girls who go and collect firewood in Africa daily by measuring the amount of hours saved by moving to the cook stoves and alternative fuels which we provide. So as far as I'm concerned, the world is changing. I find now our Korean investors for the South Korean compliance market, who have now asked us to invest in another 500,000 stoves around the world and growing, to invest in gas leak reduction and efficient gas cook stoves in Bangladesh, and 30 million light bulbs, LED light bulbs in India. Their Ministry of Environment said, if we're going to introduce emissions reductions into our compliance trade, they have to come from the least developed countries, and they have to come from pro-poor investments. They're already looking under the hood in terms of how they're going to account for themselves as meeting their compliance obligations. It's a new world, and I expect this will happen repeatedly as governments reluctantly realize they do have to go to the offset market. But if they're going to go there, they're going to look for quality, and quality is not just the environmental integrity of the carbon credit itself, it's what good the projects that are underlying those credits do.
Thanks, Ken. And last but not least, I'd like to introduce Jonathan Parfrey. Jonathan Parfrey is the Executive Director of Climate Resolve. Before founding Climate Resolve, Jonathan served as a commissioner at the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power. He's founder and vice chair of Ciclavia, a popular cycling event in Los Angeles, as well as founder of the Los Angeles Regional Collaborative for Climate Action and Sustainability and the statewide Alliance of Regional Collaboratives for Climate Adaptation. He was appointed to Governor Schwarzenegger's environmental policy team in 2003. Jonathan.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Robert. I was really inspired by what Ken and Henry were talking about. Henry, I wish our South Coast AQMD had people who were actually working on decarbonization. There's such a focus on trying to meet the targets related to criteria air pollution that I've been told by the department there that they simply don't have the capacity to try to deal with climate change, which is unfortunate. Our organization was founded about 8 years ago, and it's primarily an advocacy organization. Our assessment was this, that we saw that support for climate action, even though it's popular in the state of California, it's never ranks very high in terms of priorities. And so other immediate issues often take precedence and have greater priority. And for those of us in the room, we really know that climate change is the monumental challenge of the human species at this time. And of course, we also recognize there's some opportunity right now. So our group's theory of change is that we had to make climate change something that was more urgent and immediate in people's lives. They needed to see it as relevant and to see their place in the climate picture. And so even though climate change is indeed a global phenomenon, people don't live globally. They live in their own city. They live in their own neighborhood. And the climate effects on the neighborhood at that neighborhood scale is something that I think is of great interest to them and their families looking forward. And it also provides a context of understanding what this might mean for other people as well. So in addition to putting people in that context, when we were starting as an organization, we focused in on climate solutions. And we felt that it's really important for folks to be able to feel as if they can actually have agency, that there's something that they can actually do. And so, again, people like to see the fruits of their engagement. And so our solutions have been very much focused at the local scale. So this is what we've done. In 2013, our organization won a change in LA's building code, mandating cool roofs on all new and retrofitted rooftops. And we also have now moved this to other cities in Los Angeles County and then at the county itself. We've also been creating cool streets so that there's the cool roofs and cool streets, they provide an immediate feedback mechanism. People actually see that things are cooler in their own experience. And this is very interesting. One of the areas that we've been pursuing is looking at the CO2e of high albedo materials, of reflective materials. And so, in fact, our organization is preparing to submit a methodology to Climate Action Reserve on how to quantify CO2e from high albedo surface materials. We also felt that what's immediate in Los Angeles, traffic, everyone knows that. So we felt it was important to reduce greenhouse gas emissions related to transportation. And I was in the other room with Edie Chang, and she put on the pie chart of the California Air Resources Board on greenhouse gas emissions, and she put transportation at 37%. That's what comes out of the tailpipe, but what she didn't put on the screen were all of the emissions from refineries, where if you add refinery emissions to transportation emissions, it's a full 50% of California's GHG emissions are in transportation. So our organization felt it was very important to provide alternatives, and not just EVs, so people can proceed about the way they normally proceed by living on the freeway, but instead to work for a new solution on public transportation. And we were one of the lead organizations in winning Measure M in November 2016, a notable election. But in LA, we were able to tax ourselves to the tune of $120 billion over the next 40 years. And even our friends in the Bay Area have to admit that's a pretty big number. That's a pretty big number, yeah. So when we're also working on land use matters, trying to change policies related to that, affordable housing near transportation corridors. And we were also the lead organization in trying to stop a new freeway. Believe it or not, in Los Angeles, they believe there's still room for another freeway out in LA County, which would create another San Fernando Valley out in the high desert, dozens of miles away from any job center. And so we were, I shouldn't say we're successful. We're in negotiations with Caltrans right now over a lawsuit, and I predict good things. So this is all kind of a preface to kind of the programmatic voluntary GHG reductions that I really want to talk to you about, because we're really a proud participant in a project that you may have heard about where there's a major development in LA County, and unlike the desert community, this project, Newhall Ranch in the Santa Clarita Valley, is committed to being a net zero development. And it has been approved via the CEQA process, and it committed not to just do a percentage of GHG reduction, but a full 100% GHG reduction for everything, not just for Z&E buildings, but for transportation in and out, for any commercial, industrial activities taking place on that property. In fact, the plans for the development on site are very robust. There's EVs, there's solar that's being planned, just starting now. But the footprint of the actual development is not enough. And so the developers have come up with a portfolio, a variety of different means to get to this voluntary mitigation of greenhouse gas emissions that they're anticipating at that development. And so there's a whole portfolio, and our organization is focused on providing mitigation projects within LA County. And so some of these take place in the form of pool covers, low-income community pools. Some of it is on low-income homes that cannot put solar on the roof because the roof is so deteriorated. We're putting on a cool roof. And then we're putting on photovoltaics onto those roofs, working with a group here in California called Grid Alternatives. And there are clear co-benefits. You're including low-income people in the Los Angeles region, and we've selected these communities through the Cal Enviro Screen process that OEHA has that identifies disadvantaged communities, and those are the areas that we're working to provide these mitigation efforts. And this project is, the methodologies are being submitted to CAR, and the emission reductions will be verified by LA County. And I have to just underscore the promise of this work and the kind of the bold leadership of the developer 5 Point to do this. Like, imagine now that we have set a standard in the state of California where every development, every new development, large or small, is going to be net zero in its lifetime. And it's sort of like, if you're familiar with stormwater capture, it's like low impact development, keeping it there, but for greenhouse gas emissions. And I think that if this is scaled up across the state, it could really release an incredible amount of capital to decarbonize. And again, what I find exciting about this is that it benefits low-income communities where a lot of voters are, where a lot of politicians care about the lives of these voters, care about the lives of these individuals, and we're providing direct benefit to them. Candidly, is it more expensive in mitigate a ton? Oh yeah, it is. But the co-benefits are enormous. Thank you.
Thanks, Jonathan. And when you opened, you said that, climate change is important to a lot of people, but it's never really a high priority in how they act. And something that all three of you touched on was this concept of co-benefits. Ken with the public health, Jonathan with low income. And it seems to me that interest in climate change, whether people are interested in actually acting on climate change or not, I think everyone is interested in acting on all these co-benefits. So could you guys talk to me about, how we use co-benefits and, possibly measure them, possibly put some quantity to these co-benefits to leverage those for action on climate change?
But look, I want to make a comment also just following up on Jonathan's statement. We too are providing emissions reductions for the Newhall net zero objective, and it's fascinating to me because I suspect, and 5 Point might comment on that, but I suspect by virtue of us being able to provide quite low cost emissions reductions, but also doing the good that you heard me talk about, we are actually creating the space to be able to do stuff at home, which is necessarily, because of the developed nature of the Southern Californian society, much more expensive. And I'm intrigued by that balance. And it's the same kind of thing when I referred to the patchwork quilt of the evolving carbon market. Each jurisdiction will figure out what works to allow greenhouse gases to be managed in a cost-effective way on balance while choosing the amount they do at home and how they do it and how they focus it, and the amount that they do recognizing that climate change is a global phenomenon, and it doesn't matter where in the world you reduce with integrity emissions reductions, it has the same impact on managing climate change. So what Newhall has given rise to is an insight, a book to look into and to replicate for all sorts of other corporations. We are, of course, providing these high co-benefit emissions reductions for the first time from outside California into a Californian compliance regime, evolving, of course, not as highly regulated yet, but by precedence, one can assume it will be. We're, I mentioned, able to provide for developers, if they wish, an independent third-party verification of the lifetime additions to healthy living of women and children through the gold standard verification. You don't have to do it and verify it every year. A third-party verification of expected lifetime emissions is a good start. The reduction in hours, which turns out to be over the life of our cook stove, 60 full days or 120 12-hour days of time, granted additional time to a woman or a girl, girls to go to school, women to do things they would like to do with their time as opposed to carry bundles of wood around over the life of the 7-year life of the stove. I expect that we can begin to have third-party verification on all sorts of other things, but I want to simply make the comment that the opportunity of third-party verification is important to corporates and governments to add credibility to their statements that they're doing well by doing good.
So, you know, in the air pollution world, I mean, it's not a new thing to think about the intersection between climate and air pollution, okay? I mean, the bill I mentioned, AB 617, has certainly injected steroids into that conversation, but we've been thinking about this for a while, and certainly the state has. Several years ago, the Air Resources Board prepared the mobile source strategy. They prepared that in partnership with the San Joaquin and South Coast Air Districts to specifically identify transportation programs that are regulatory programs. Local districts like mine can't regulate anything that moves. We regulate industry. The State Air Resources Board regulates cars, trucks, buses, anything that moves. Some things are subject to federal regulation, but the Air Resources Board regulates mobile sources. And so their mobile source strategy laid out a series of programs, additional regulations that would continue to make progress in air quality improvement in San Joaquin Valley and South Coast that have severe air quality issues, and also make greenhouse gas reductions. And Jonathan, I always appreciate a favorable comparison with the South Coast District because we're way better than they are. But I would have to admit, and they would certainly say, that they have had a climate program. I mean, they have impacted communities in Wilmington, near the Port of LA, near the Port of Long Beach, that's one of their most impacted communities, and they've been putting all kinds of resources into solving that problem, and a major component of that is certainly putting filters, diesel particulate filters, but also converting to cleaner technology, zero and near zero technology. And so to the extent that we can electrify equipment at those San Pedro ports or up here at the Port of Oakland, that's going to reduce diesel particulate in those localized communities, but it also reduces GHG emissions. So there is a very solid co-benefit there. It reduces CO2 emissions and it reduces black carbon, which is a climate forcer. So we very much are interested in pushing, moving away from fossil fuels, diesel especially, because it is such a risk driver in our local communities. And so we're working on some new initiatives now to really amplify that. But I think we will continue to focus on reducing fossil fuel combustion, particularly in mobile sources. And I think that's our one of our main approaches right now to really harmonize those two equally important objectives.
So first, Ken, I just want to say the concept of a portfolio is really exciting. And the fact that there can be lower cost GHG reductions that provide real benefits abroad, I think can be harmonized with local benefits. And I really appreciate that comment because I think it's important to have these local benefits. The co-benefit here is building political will and solidifying political support for these projects going forward. I think we heard it in the other room with Edie Chang, that it's important that people see that there are some benefits to the cap and trade program that they're paying for here within the state itself. One of the great co-benefits of cool roofs, by the way, if you didn't know, there's not only the cooling that happens in the home that reduces energy use by either HVAC or refrigeration, but with the extreme heat days that we're already experiencing and will experience more in coming decades, there is a direct benefit in terms of resilience of communities by deploying these kinds of technologies. So that's something that people can experience quite directly. And to your point, Henry, about the South Coast, my friends at Move LA and I are pitching them on this concept of a fall of 2020, putting a quarter-cent sales tax within the South Coast region. And that will generate around $700 million a year. And we can finally find ways of funding getting rid of the diesel trucks that are moving through our region that are causing so many health problems. But we're trying to move it towards either low or no emission movement of goods, which I think will be transformative in Los Angeles. And we might even be moving towards a time when LA's air quality will actually meet federal standards. It's very exciting.
Great, thanks. So we have a hard stop in here at 3:40, so I'll ask one more question and then open it up to audience questions. And just to hone in again on something you said, Jonathan, not to pick on you, but you talked about how expensive the roofs are. And I think there's just this overarching tension in the voluntary space of, trying to balance the cost per emission reduction with environmental integrity and making sure that the emission reductions are real and all the things that Ken's been talking about. So the Reserve's been working on a program that's aimed at generating a bunch of credits upfront for project developers. And can you talk a little bit about the potential that forward crediting mechanisms and things of that nature can bring to the voluntary marketplace, and particularly maybe your projects?
I would prefer to hear from Ken on this subject.
Yeah, look, this is a revolution in a way, a quiet revolution, and a very positive one. The voluntary market has been characterized by spot purchases, right? So the only way you can supply into the voluntary market historically is to go ahead and speculate and invest in what you feel someone might need through a request for proposal sometime in the future. Or if you know that they come to the market regularly and you see what they're buying and you have that intelligence, which is hard to gather, you might go out and speculate that you go and invest in a project and they may buy your credits in the future. They do not enter into long-term emissions reductions purchase agreements as a norm. That's not the standard of the voluntary market. Corporates have annual budgets. They don't like to make long-term commitments typically. And when they go carbon neutral, they'll just put out an RFP and say, it's got to be in registries or in my registry within 30 days of me giving you the contract. That makes it impossible for us to really engineer high-quality emissions reductions. You just happen to have what no one else will buy, and maybe that's what you offer, and see whether they'll buy it or not. This forward crediting, despite the huge haircut that you have to take for getting future emissions reductions up front from having a cook stove in use or an LED light in use, is worth it because it allows you to offer the same corporates inside their budget year the opportunity to invest in these high quality emissions reductions and get the emissions reductions out inside the fiscal year. And not to have to wait to go through the enormous uncertainty of year after year for 5 to 10 years of monitoring and verification not knowing whether the carbon will actually be there or not, and having to spend huge amounts of transaction cost time, which is, not value add in any real sense. Taking that off the table can compensate for the haircut in emissions reductions you get, and give rise to still well-priced emissions reductions despite the reduction in emissions reductions you're allowed to claim. I think that's extraordinarily positive. I know it doesn't apply to all kinds of projects, but it certainly applies to distributed, long-lived energy appliances, efficient energy appliances, and maybe small energy production systems like solar household kits in the developing countries, although they're not particularly carbon intensive. So I see there's a niche for that. I see it's very important, and I see it's tailor-made to help the likes of Five Point and other land developers who now are required to surrender before they even start development the lifetime emissions of the projects, which without forward crediting, I think would be economically a huge challenge.
Great, thanks, Ken. So now I'd like to open it up to any audience questions. Anyone out there? All right. Sorry, we're bringing a microphone back to you, so if you could use that. Thank
Another
you.
byproduct of the stoves and young girls going to school is a reduction in birth rate. When you educate women, they have less children, and that's often not talked about. Population seems to be a taboo subject whenever we talk about environmental problems. But I was wondering how you could go about getting maybe other things implemented on a local level. I was thinking about local zoning regulations. Why can't they put in there in the general plans and such that they mandate certain amount of green building or clean energy in local building? We have the Sacramento right now trying to take away some local control for zoning so there can be high intensity housing. But if they're going to take away local control for zoning, why don't they implement control at a local level for demanding low energy emitting building and building projects?
Well, I can speak to that a little bit. So you raised some really important points. A lot of the local plans, at least here in the Bay Area, do many of the things that you're talking about. I mean, a lot of the, either a city may have its standalone climate action plan or have a bunch of policies in their general plan, but it's usually a suite of measures to improve energy efficiency, to reduce waste going to the landfill, especially organic waste, reduce vehicle miles traveled, sort of all the sorts of menu of things that you mentioned and more. I can tell you land use is usually the hardest part in any of those. I mean, all these plans have great energy efficiency goals and waste reduction goals, just first class. Land use is the third rail, and it is extraordinarily difficult. People are really nervous about land use changes. I live in Berkeley, which is a fairly liberal place, right? We've got sister cities all over the place.
I didn't know it was liberal.
Everything, I mean, look, you name it, every policy, we've got it. But you try and build a high-density mixed-use project downtown near our BART station, people freak out, okay? And that's in Berkeley. So it's really hard. The land use transportation nexus, 375 helps in California, but and all the vehicle technology that we've talked about and others here have talked about are huge. But those land use patterns to reduce vehicle miles traveled, both increasing cycling, walking, transit, but just making the land use patterns that are more supportive of that are essential. But boy, politically, it's tough. It's really hard.
So I think sometimes the state of California doesn't do a very good job of selling the amazing story that it has. So, I don't know if you know this, but Title 24 is the state's building code for energy. And there's a target that every new building that is built in the state of California has to be zero net energy when it's built in the year 2020 and beyond. That is in code. That is what has to happen. So most people don't know this. Henry referred to SB 375, which sets regional targets on reducing VMT, vehicle miles traveled. And what people don't realize are the implications of this rule. That means that if you have a development that isn't reducing its VMT or GHG emissions, right, then the rest of the county has to tighten its belt even more to make up for the extravagance of the GHG that's emitted from new development. Now, Newhall, to its credit, has completely sidestepped this problem by going to net zero, which I think sets a standard for the rest of the state. The rest of the state just doesn't know it yet.
Any other questions?
Hi, I had a question for Ken, actually. So obviously the idea you're describing here is amazing and inspiring and has a million co-benefits that you talked about. I've heard some people criticize the concept of the global north, like increasing their emissions by reducing emissions in the global south. And I was wondering if you have come across that viewpoint very often, and if so, is there any validity to it, or is it just something that people like to throw out there?
I haven't heard that for a long time. Look, the South wants to grow, obviously, and with growth, it's reasonable to expect increase in energy use, but it doesn't have to be fossil-based, it doesn't have to be greenhouse gas intensive, and they have hopefully the access that that developed countries have to leading-edge technologies in real time, and that's what excites me now about working with Tesla to bring solar storage technology to Malawi and to Africa for the first time, and that's barely here. I mean, this technology we're transporting is in Hawaii, in Kauai Island. There is a 13 megawatt, 52 megawatt hour storage facility, solar in a day, delivering all the energy stored into the night. That's what we're proposing in the case of Malawi. But they're using Tesla battery technology to capture spilled hydropower energy at night in low demand periods and to send it back into the peak hours to displace diesel power during the day. I'm just giving you that illustration because technology moves very quickly to places where it's economically favored, and this is leading edge technology that is particularly in need and will find a home in the developing countries. To the point of helping getting, for example, cook stove carbon emissions reductions or LED lighting emissions reductions into these economies like California or the US as a whole, or Southern Korea. The fact of the matter is that the countries have entered into, under their Paris Agreement, nationally determined commitments to reduce emissions reductions. The developing countries have focused on sustainable energy access to the poor, and they're expecting that trade will give them the opportunity for both technology and capital transfer to implement those objectives. And they're willing to account in their national accounts that they're transferring these emissions reductions to the investing country in exchange for the benefits, all of those rich co-benefits of upgrading the energy base in all of the ways we've spoken of, cleaner, more sustainable energy, as part of the bargain. So it's no longer a question of inequity in energy consumption per se. There will be inequity. The opportunity to grow cleanly is now more than ever with the dramatic revolution that Tesla is, and of course there are other battery manufacturers in the world, but Tesla's in the lead, turning solar energy into baseload power within 5 years from now, so that you wouldn't even need to consider a coal or gas-fired power plant in many countries, simply because battery storage has gone so low, you're going to be able to do solar during the day with battery storage for the rest of your peak, morning and evening peak, for 15 cents. That's where I see it going. You know, I have a house in Ohio where I pay 24 cents at the margin for my power. There's a revolution happening here. So growth in energy can happen cleanly anyway, but the bargain, the compact entered into under the Paris Agreement, I think is a very satisfactory one. And what we're doing here in California for the first time, I think is remarkable. You may not fully understand the significance of what Newhall Ranch and Five Point have done in convincing Air Resources Board to agree that 20% of the emissions reductions can come from international emissions. It not only creates this opportunity for the mixed portfolio to do very much higher cost abatement here to service the poor with those co-benefits, but it allows California to support sustainable development through mostly private sector means, which would otherwise not be available, certainly with the federal administration we have at the moment.
Thanks, Ken. And I think the applause over there is our cue that we have to end our session. Please join me in thanking our panel today.